today I'm talking to you about the Tamron 35mm f2.8 Di3 lens. Now this is one of a trio of prime lenses that was introduced back in November 2019. The other lenses being the 24mm and the 20mm. Now, as lenses become ever faster and ever larger and have corresponding price tags, it's nice to see Tamron doing something a little bit different here. The modest apertures and price tags may put off the lens snobs, but they have enabled Tamron to give good optical performance at a very, very reasonable price. So I'm now going to switch over to the Tamron 35mm f2.8 and film this using it on a Sony A7r2. The aperture is f2.8 and we'll see how we get along. Okay. In terms of the build quality, the internet has largely been critical of it, but when you look at it, the body is made out of some form of engineering plastic, which, if you listen to all the hullabaloo about it, you'd think had been manufactured by Tupperware. But when you compare the lens to recent Sigma and Canon L lenses, there is very little to distinguish the Tamron from the others. The only difference I can find, without some sort of destructive testing, is that the Tamron has a slightly more satin finish than the more matte finish of the Canons and the Sigmas. The lens mount appears to be chrome-plated brass, which is nice. There is an O-ring, which provides some semblance of sealing from the elements at the mount. Now, on the lens barrel, there is only a ribbed focusing ring. That's the only control that there is. And the focus is of the focus by wire type, which means there is little chance of repeatable focus pulls with it. Like all Tamron's mirrorless range so far, the 35mm f2.8 has a 67mm filter thread. And Tamron thoughtfully include a lens hood with the lens. It is not the conventional bucket or petal shape. Instead, it is like a plastic blank that has a rectangular hole cut in it. And it's very effective at preventing flare and would provide a good degree of protection to the front element. The hood, unusually, is also threaded to take 67mm filters, which means that you don't have to remove it if you want to use a filter. I think this shows that somebody at Tamron has been doing some thinking. The hood bayonets into place nice and securely, and it's easy to take on and take off. The vital statistics of the Tamron 35mm f2.8 Di3 are as follows. The focal length is of course 35mm and the maximum aperture is f2.8. The angle of view on the diagonal is 63 degrees and 26 minutes for full frame mirrorless format. The optical construction is 9 elements in 8 groups, with 1 low dispersion element and 1 moulded glass spherical element. The minimum object distance is 15 centimeters. The maximum magnification ratio is 1:2. The filter size is 67mm. The diameter of the lens at its widest point is 73mm and its length is 64mm. In terms of weight, it comes in at 210 grams. It has a 7-blade circular diaphragm. The circular diaphragm stays almost perfectly circular up to 2 stops down from the maximum aperture, according to Tamron's literature. Minimum aperture is f22, and the standard accessories are a lens hood and lens caps, and it only comes in Sony E mount. In terms of sharpness, well, at f2.8, at the centre of the image, the lens is nicely sharp and contrasty. At f4, the lens reaches its best performance and stays there to f11. At the edges wide open, it isn't quite as sharp as the centre, but by f5.6, the edges are as good as the centre. The old adage of stopping down 2 stops from wide open to achieve optimum performance certainly holds true for this lens. By f16, the image starts to soften as diffraction rears its ugly head. Flare resistance is definitely a bit on the pedestrian side without the lens hood, with ghosting clearly visible. The lens hood is included in the box for a good reason, so use it. The 7-bladed iris produces what to me are quite attractive sun stars. Speaking of how the lens handles specular highlights, the bokeh is not what I would call thrilling, but it's not offensive either. Wide open in the centre there are round balls with faint onion rings present from the moulded aspherical elements. I suppose the final polishing wasn't as smooth as that on more expensive lenses as a cost-cutting measure. The edges of the balls are not smooth, they have a fuzzy appearance as the light bleeds into the darker areas, which is a form of halation. And at the edges of the image, the bokeh balls take on that elliptical cat's eye shape. By f8, the bokeh balls take on a definite polygonal shape. Now this lens can focus down to 15 centimeters. I don't intend to get quite that close, but we'll see how close I can get. I won't get any closer, I think I've terrified too many people already. It's not as quick as the Sony lenses, but it's very workmanlike and gets the job done. For me, the interesting aspect of this lens, and indeed of its siblings, is the minimum focusing distance and its ability to shoot half-life size. This makes them very, very suitable for creative macro and close-up work. It's not what you'd use to photograph small critters, as the lens has to be very close to the subject and it will scare them off. But for product shots, still life, and other forms of tabletop photography, it is a very interesting choice. Test charts aren't the be-all and end-all of image quality, so let's look at what the lens is capable of. I've put some sample images up that I shot with the lens on both a Sony A7R and an A7R2. On the camera, the lens is nicely balanced and it doesn't feel front heavy. While not as small as the Sony Zeiss 35mm f2.8, which weighs 90 grams less, the Tamron doesn't feel a burden and it makes a very nice walk around lens. While the autofocus isn't as snappy as Sony's lenses, it does a good job when shooting stills with single AF. When shooting in continuous autofocus with a moving subject, the performance is just average when using the A7R2. Overall, I felt that this was a very enjoyable lens to use, whether I was shooting landscapes with a tripod, shooting macro, or wandering around shooting street photos. So in conclusion, what can I say about this lens? Well, at the time of testing, the Tamron lens is selling for about 350 Australian dollars. So you want to go full frame mirrorless with a 35mm prime lens, but don't want f1.2 lenses or can't afford them, you buy the Tamron. Don't want to carry around a lens that's big enough to block the Suez Canal? Buy the Tamron. It's nowhere near the perfect lens. It's a modest lens with a modest price and with a better than modest performance. I think it's a great buy, and I'm definitely going to keep my copy. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful, and I look forward to joining you in the next video.